Hello, everyone. This is Meredith Leindecker, Director of Tally Dun Gallery, coming to you again from this time my library dining room space. And we are so honored to have Sarah Williams, one of our favorite artists, here on the Zoom with us, with me and my colleague Ari Edwards, who I'm so glad to have here with me. Sarah, how are you?
I'm doing well. I'm glad to hear you guys are doing all right. It's always a pleasure to talk with you.
Yes, we are so happy to have you here, and we're so excited to get a peek into your studio space in a little bit. So
Absolutely.
I'm excited about that. I have not yet gotten to visit you in person, and of course,
Mhm.
hopefully at some point I will, but when it's safe.
Yeah, I hear you.
Well, we are so excited to talk to you, and we just have a couple of questions, but we're just going to have a conversation. And so maybe I'll start with the big question, which is how in this year, and we're in December of 2020 now,
Mhm.
how was it for you kind of adjusting to this new normal that we all are working with, not only in your studio, but also in your teaching? Sarah is a professor at Missouri State University.
Yeah, it's been kind of an unusual time because in the spring, when all of this started, I was on my first sabbatical from Missouri State. And obviously, no one saw this coming. And I had intended to use that time to attend residencies I'd been accepted to, and also do a couple of mini road trips around the mostly Midwest, just to look for different areas I hadn't had access to before, investigate different structures and towns, and then continue to compare them to what I know from North Missouri. But some of those plans were changed just because of pandemic cancellations. I feel super fortunate that, first of all, I have remained healthy and safe, knock on wood, and so has my family and my friends. So really thankful for that. But I also was able to complete one residency I'd been awarded in Key West, Florida before all of the pandemic happened. And I was down there from the middle of February through the middle of March. And the last week really started to kind of like pick up with the discussion of the pandemic and like what's going on, what's happening, like what do we need to do. I was actually nervous. I'd driven down there. I was nervous that they were going to close the bridges because there's like 7 miles of bridges just between one little span between the keys. And I was afraid they were going to shut it down because they were trying to limit traffic and people coming in and out. So I was able to drive home, made it. And 2 days after that, Springfield went on lockdown, like a mandatory lockdown. So the timing was just outrageous. But I was able to have my entire residency in Key West, and I met two great artists that I was there with for that month. I investigated more like the only tropical place I've really been before, and see the little structures. And Key West has an incredible amount of history, and the architecture and sort of the folklore that goes along with some of it. I learned a lot of really interesting things. And in fact, right now I'm working on a body of work for an upcoming show that will focus on all the Key West stuff. So it's been fun, obviously, to relive it while I'm working on that. But after I got home, I wasn't able to go to another residency I'd been awarded in Cape Cod. I didn't go on any of the road trips just because I was staying close to home. But it gave me so much time just to work in my studio. And again, because I was on sabbatical, I didn't have to go anywhere. I didn't really have to think about how to handle my teaching. I feel for all my colleagues on campus because they had to pivot right in the middle of the semester because everything was forced online. And then the question becomes, well, how do you teach studio art online?
Right.
So, I've been back in it this fall, and I've had such great students. Like, I've been so fortunate. They've just been fantastic and totally engaged and up for anything that had to be done because it's, an unusual circumstance, but they've been great. But being a professor and trying to maintain my studio practice is always a challenge, and doing it during a pandemic when so many things are online and there's so many emails and there's so many digital things, it's been a challenge. But everybody faces those things, just finding the balance.
Yeah. Well, and I think I don't know about you, but in this time I've always really tried to find like the positive out of every situation. And I feel like, I was so excited for you. And of course, we had a show for Sarah's amazing new work in January of this year, which was such an amazing
Mhm.
start to the year. We had Nita Mangesh in the main gallery, and
Mhm.
it was wonderful. It really was. And I was so excited to see the work that came out of the Key West residency and also Cape Cod. I hope at some point you'll get to go back in the future.
No.
I think a lot of people, there's so many, anytime people see your work for the first time, there's so many questions. First, they think, oh, is this a photograph? No, it's a painting. That's the
Mhm.
first amazing thing about it. But I think a lot of people don't know that a lot of your practice involves driving around in these rural areas, sometimes places that you do know, but sometimes places that you don't know. And that's the really interesting part about seeing a body
Mhm.
of work years from a different part of the country. And that's for me, I see it as kind of like a little history of the States almost, or kind of a history of where you've been, which I think is so
Yeah.
wonderful. Yeah. So, I mean, I think a lot of people, when they're seeing your work for the first time, Sarah, a lot of people don't know that so much of your practice, or at least how your practice starts, is really driving around through either rural areas, maybe in Missouri that really well, or, when you're doing a residency in a different part of the country, a place that you don't know really well, and kind of discovering these new places and spots and structures and really kind of documenting them. I think it's such a wonderful history of the country and the places that you've been. Do you want to talk a little bit about that and kind of like how that
Absolutely.
works?
Yeah, and I appreciate your feedback on that because it's always interesting. I'm so close to it and I care so passionately about it. Sometimes I don't understand how an outside eye or perspective would interpret what I'm doing. And that was one of the things that was super surprising to me when I started exhibiting my work. And firstly, just presenting the work in grad school when I was in the Denton, which is, Dallas Fort Worth area. And exponentially larger than any place that I had ever lived. And I know people referred to Denton as like small town. That's a joke. It's huge. It's huge. Like the campus alone was like, would dwarf my hometown, the whole area, the end of the state practically.
Really? Oh my God. And
Yeah.
tell us, so you're from a small town in Missouri called Brookfield, correct?
I'm
And
from Brookfield, Missouri.
what's the
Yeah. It's
population there?
just over 4,000. And
Wow.
it's the thing about it though is in the Dallas Fort Worth area, all the towns and cities, they're next door to each other. There's never really a start and stop. And with Brookfield, like where I'm from, there is a good 30 minutes, 30 miles. We always talk about distance in minutes. There's a good 30 minutes worth of just cropland or, cattle or some kind of livestock between the towns. There isn't anything like no other town, no like, shops or stores or whatever. And the reason I've come to realize is that that is how far it took on horseback to travel between towns. So
Wow.
that's a day's ride, 30 miles. And that's why it is that way still, apparently. But when I went to the University of North Texas to study for my master's, that was the first time I'd been away from my hometown, and it added perspective. It brought me to the work in kind of like a roundabout way. But I did not intend, once I started making this work, for people to relate to it almost as if it were an exotic thing. And I've never considered my hometown that way. And being able to have exhibitions and display these structures in places like Dallas and Houston and LA and even New York, I get feedback from people that have never lived in the Midwest. And sometimes it's interesting in that they find it like it feels like someplace that they have been on either a road trip, like they're traveling through places like that, or maybe they have like a childhood experience visiting a grandparent or something like that. And they're like, oh, it reminds me of XYZ. Or some people are completely freaked out. I did not anticipate that, because seeing a black horizon line where there's not any kind of light pollution or an indication of more structures or other, towns or whatever, that's comforting for me. But a lot of people are off, put off by that, like because it feels too barren or open or just empty, I guess. So living in Denton, Dallas-Fort Worth area, it allowed me to see my hometown in a way that I would never have been able to if I didn't leave it. And now doing these residencies around the country, because a lot of times they're a month long, and that's enough time to really kind of get invested in wherever I'm stationed and learn about this town, the structures, the people that live there, the way of life, the industry that goes on. Because in the Midwest, a lot of it's driven by being an agrarian society. Everything is about farming, farm culture. And because of that, being outside, being in tune with like the seasons and the planting schedules and your livestock, so that feels very different than what you might be aware of in a city, in the sense of time and space in the city. So doing these residencies and traveling around, it's so important to help keep me informed and keep me understanding like new components I hadn't considered about how I relate to my home. And also, like you mentioned, Meredith, I always like to tell this story, but you're right. I take really poor snapshots to use as my reference material, because when I started making this body of work in grad school, it initially started, I didn't realize at the time, but it started as a way to manage my homesickness. And I had these little 4x6 snapshots, that you just print at a drugstore. And I kind of carried them around with me just to kind of remind myself of something that felt familiar when everything did not, when I was living in Denton. And I decided just to paint one. And it got an incredible response. And I think it was because I intuitively understood that was much more important to me than whatever I had been doing, which granted, it was pretty hollow. But, it's just been kind of an interesting journey to keep questioning my home, keep trying to see it and appreciate it in a different way than what I had originally understood about it just growing up. But yes, driving around and trying to take the resource imagery, I'm using a point and shoot camera that I got in college way back in early 2000s. It's still alive. But I like for them to be awful, because I want the image just to be enough information to show me where the structure was and where the basic light source is. And I love color. I love painting. I love pushing paint around. So it leaves me enough room to be creative and ad lib, and that's where the fun part is. But when I'm doing this, a lot of times it looks suspicious, like somebody driving around in a small town at night taking photos of stuff. And granted, I'm not like out on foot necessarily, like walking around and like really working a place over. A lot of times it's like a drive-by snapshot leave, because the cops come. People call the cops on me. And so, it looks suspicious. I understand. But a lot of times I'll get pulled over and they'll say, "What are you doing?" And I'll explain, and it's handy always to have like one of my cards for either my website or, my card that shows that I'm a professor at Missouri State. So at least gives me a little bit of legitimacy.
Yeah, that's so funny. Well, and I mean, there definitely is kind of a voyeuristic quality in some of your work, especially like one of my favorites is the television series where you documented all these different homes and you can kind of see the TV on through maybe like a curtain or a window, but they're so interesting and nostalgic. And I just love that about them. And it's funny that you say that people, you might get stopped by the police, which like such an innocent, necessary part of what you're doing. And it's not weird.
Right. Yes.
And I think I was just gonna say, I think that you've been doing this type of work for a while now, but a lot of us in this age, in this year, are looking back, like we're watching old shows and we're looking at, our old photo albums and trying to like connect to our past in different ways. I think because of just the stressful nature of what's going on right now. So I think it's really interesting that, you sort of always have been interested in examining where you come from and places like where you come from. I think it's really beautiful.
Absolutely. Thank you. I appreciate that. And just, it's amazing how, like you say, it's part of your life, it's part of your identity, but sometimes you can't own it until you specifically articulate it. You're able to articulate it. And so I never knew I had all these tendencies. Like when I was a kid, we would take 1 or 2 trips a year to Kansas City, and my parents would take me to the Nelson Atkins Art Museum, and they'd have the regionalist section, and I was inevitably drawn to that. I didn't know why, but now I realize it's because I recognized it. I recognized the imagery, and I thought, okay, well, that's just like what I see on the trips between towns, or when we go to visit, family member in the next town over or whatever it is. So it felt empowering that in that way, like what I knew could be important enough to be in a museum. Not, that it would happen, but I remember thinking that, and that was empowering, definitely.
Yeah, for sure. Well, and I think this, another question we have that kind of goes into what we've been talking about is, you spoke about having just like that rough snapshot and then knowing where the source of light is coming from. And I think one of my absolute favorite parts of your work is how you capture light, both artificial and not artificial. It is the most incredible thing I've ever seen, really. And every time people see your work, people ask me about it and ask me how you do it. And it's just like, that's a trade secret, I'm sure. But I think a question we have is, your paintings are so luminous with that light, and they're also really rich in the colors that you use, without, like exposing too much. Can you talk a little bit about just your actual process of painting?
Absolutely. And because I teach, like, I'm very used to talking about the technique and the approach and aspects like that. So I'm happy to divulge. But I'm definitely a colorist. I love pigment. I love colors. I love mixing things. I think at the end of the day, I'm most happy when I can just push paint around. I like using different brushes. I like investigating the different marks that they leave and the edges and the transitions, and trying to get that sense of glow and light, and addressing both like artificial light, but also atmospheric light. It's just, to boil it down to its simplest terms, it's just about value transitions and edge, and intensity and chroma. I think honestly, some of my favorite colors are chromatic grays, because they make those intense chromatic pops really shine and really do their thing. But it's all kind of like an orchestration of these things and how the eye picks up on color, because it's not necessarily about the thing you're looking at, the color you're drawn to that might be the focal point. It's about all the things next door to it that make it read that way. So it's just this ongoing puzzle. And honestly, like, I'm engaged in my my subject matter, but I'm just as engaged with the act of painting and problem solving in the moment. I love it. So I think I've spoken about with you all before in the past, not today, but they're all nocturnal paintings. But I don't use black out of a tube. I'm very passionate about that. In fact, I don't allow my painting students to have black.
Yep.
But I love optical blacks, and it gives you so much more power in how you handle space and depth. Because if you make your own black, then you can control the temperature, and you can indicate hidden edges that only come out to a viewer if you spend time and investigate it. So it's like a little reward for staying with a painting. So I like to have little things like that in my work, for sure. What else? What else would you like for me to talk about in terms of
awesome.
When thinking about and listening to you speak, and thinking about like my experience with the work, because the paintings are so small, you really do have to get up to them. And like when you see them from far away, like Meredith was saying, like the way you deal with light and color is so successful, and then you get up close to them and you're like, oh my god, so that's what's happening, like you were talking about like edges and all that kind of thing. Can you talk about the scale of your work and why you choose to work that size, and would you ever go bigger, or do you
Absolutely.
want
Yeah, that's a great question. I keep my work somewhat small. It doesn't ever really get bigger, at most than 48 inches. Most of the time stopping around 36 inches. But I think it's important with the subject matter I'm dealing with to keep it somewhat small, because I don't want it to be shouting. I almost want the viewer, my audience, to have to walk to it. So that almost is symbolic to me in a way of getting a viewer to go to my hometown. I know that's ridiculous, but it's like sympathetic magic in a way. Because, you know, small towns everywhere, they're really struggling, especially right now. And I think it's just because big box stores, you know, they're more frequent, especially like, you know, they're infiltrating even the small areas, but you get a better deal there, you know, and they have more things than possibly the little hardware store that's been in the town for generations. And then the internet, you know, you can find anything on the internet and you can get a pretty good deal. But keeping your money in the town, you know, in the community, is just vital for the town's health. So I keep my work small. That's like a roundabout way of talking about this, but I like to keep it small because I want you as a viewer to have to go to it. I want you to have to get close to really appreciate some of the little secret things that I try and hide in there. Just like the interpretation of space and maybe small handling of detail or specificity. I think of it more of like specificity than detail, because the more specific the information is, I find the more universal it can be to an audience member. So if I can get, you know, a piece of the landscape to feel like it would in the time of year I'm painting or the kind of night that I'm painting, I think that will ring a bell with an audience member, you know, someone that's looking. So that's what I want, ideally. I don't think they would work the way I want them to work if they were like 5 feet tall.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It would contradict the area, you know, it would contradict small town America.
For sure. And I think that intimate quality really lends itself to having for the viewer to have that moment, like you were saying, with the space. I mean, I can't tell you how many times people have seen your work in the gallery and they have told me, oh, this reminds me of, you know, my grandmother's house that I visited when I was growing up. You know, it's just, it's such a nostalgic, intimate feeling that I think your work evokes, and it's really special and it's so individual for each person.
Thank you.
That's why I love it.
Thank you.
But kind of segueing into, you know, as we're talking about back into the studio, how is your practice? I know you kind of talked about when COVID hit and everything, you know, you got to spend more time in the studio, kind of a double-edged sword. You didn't get to go on residency, but it did lend itself to more studio time. I guess that's kind of a more positive aspect of the situation that we're in. But did anything else kind of affect your practice in that way in terms of the pandemic?
You know, having this time on sabbatical, which was during the pandemic, it allowed me to really, I think, not have any breaks in my thought process. I never had to stop and worry about what I need to prepare for class or try to plan something for a meeting or prepare some presentation, you know, that I would be making in the department. And so it was just, I think it allowed me to think more deeply, be more self-reflective. And I found, I mean, maybe to an outside person, it's like, well, yeah, duh. But I guess I didn't realize how autobiographical this work is. Yes, it's about something that I know in terms of a space and a place, but it's also autobiographical about my personality, my identity, I think. And that's probably not visible to anyone but me, but it makes me appreciate it all that much more and engage with it on another level.
That's amazing. I love that. Well, if you're willing, could we maybe peek inside your studio?
Absolutely. Yes. And let me try to turn this around. Okay, yeah. So one thing, sorry, this is like where I try not to give everybody seasickness. One thing that I did when I got tenure several years ago is I moved to a new house that had a 3-car garage. And so I converted one half of the garage, you know, like there's still room through there that I keep my shop, and I cut all my wood and panels, build my panels and stuff so it's separate and my car can be in there. But this whole area, I had it constructed so that it's my studio. and I'm in love with it. It's kind of like
Great.
what I had dreamed, and it looks kind of messy, but that's an artist studio. But it's got, you know, a floating floor so that it's a little softer to stand on. I had a vent put in over my palette over there, and I'll walk to it here in a second. And I've also got a little air filter there and pothos to help, you know, plant material. So hopefully it keeps the air circulating a little bit better than it was like when I was just painting a bedroom. But you do what you got to do. Also, I got a little split unit there so that it keeps it warm and cool, which is nice. And obviously, you'd need a studio sink that you can destroy and make it feel disgusting and not worry about it. So, I've got some storage for works and all the wrapping materials and whatnot. And Meredith, I still have that blanket you gave me.
Oh, that's okay.
I can send it back.
Did you build
yeah.
the structure, or who built that for you?
I built it. And originally, when I had to move out of my graduate studio space, I had to move my studio into my 1-bedroom apartment, and I just put it in the bedroom. And so I constructed this thing in the closet of that apartment so that I had a place to hang paintings, you know, because I'm fairly prolific, and I've always liked to hang things on the wall while I'm working on it. But then when they're finished, you know, like they need some place to go. So I built this thing in my closet, and it's just moved with me every place after that because it's super easy construction.
That is incredible. I'm gonna have to like get with you after this and be like, how did you do that?
Oh, it's
so impressive.
Like, not really. If you saw the craftsmanship, you'd think, what? But yeah, it's just like 1x4s, and I put these slats together. I cut them to be as deep as I wanted them to be, but then just kind of like screwed it together with those corner brackets. So have some little nails top and bottom here so I can hang work. It's not too difficult. If I can build it, anybody can. And then I keep my works that I'm working on up on the wall. And since I've started teaching, like I usually have 3 or 4 going at once. But these are a glimpse of some of the things I'm prepping for my next exhibition that will be based on the Key West imagery. So it's very much about like that tropical kind of space, which has much different foliage than I'm used to in the Midwest. And that caught my eye immediately when I was down there. I can't not paint the foliage and all the crazy colors and textures. The little houses, they were very small, kind of like bungalow-esque. And there were all kinds of strange lighting situations from the weird foliage and the palm fronds. And they were like buried. And this one, I think there's going to be more pieces like this, but it's not finished yet, but you get a sense of like how all the foliage just takes over, you know? So I was really into that. But I build all these panels and I start them. This is just like a base coat, and it just starts the ground. So if you're a painter, you know, like paint hangs on to more paint better than like a raw surface, like a gessoed surface. So I just kind of get it started with an opaque mixture of various pigments like titanium white, cadmium yellow. I use some yellow ochre, cat orange. Just kind of get it going. I don't paint in a glaze sort of application. It's much more kind of alla prima, sort of opaque, but never really thick. These paintings, this one has just kind of got its first layer on, so you can see it's fairly simplified, just blocking in value systems, color systems. And this one's almost done, but I got to work on the bottom here. But it's, you know, it kind of gets more and more detailed as I make the passes. And this one's pretty well finished. They don't have its varnish on there yet, but that's where I'm going. This unfortunately has been like remote teaching command central. So I like to keep my computer and stuff out of my studio, but it's just not been something I could do this semester. But as soon as I finish my finals, it's out of here. And then this is where I'm painting over here. And this is a piece that I just put a second coat on last night, just to kind of like continue the development, refine value relationships, color relationships, kind of plan for the next stage where it'll get a little bit more information. People always comment on my walls. It's just a place for me to wipe off brushes that have got some grit in it or something. It keeps it out of my rag so I don't put it back into my brush eventually. And it's nice just to have a wall that I can do that to. So
that looks like it's like your abstract piece of art that nobody ever sees.
Exactly. And this is my painting table. A friend gave it to me. His dad was the printmaking professor at MSU for years and years, and he gave me this table. It's, I guess, an old medical tray table, so it's real high. It kind of hits my hip, which I really like. So I like to paint standing. I've got a little squishy mat here. Sometimes I think it needs to be squishier. But here's my palette, and you can see kind of like my array of colors. Generally, this is what I stick with, but occasionally I'll throw something else in just if I need something else that's specific. And some of the information I'm painting from. Here's an example of how crappy the photographs are. It's pretty bad.
That's cool. So that was
cool.
Your point and shoot, and you just got it printed out.
Yep, drugstore printout. So basically, that's the studio. Is there anything you want to see in particular that I didn't address?
I think it's a great, I think it's a great overview, and that's so amazing that you have so much space now and your plant.
Oh my gosh.
Gosh, it looks awesome.
I know, I love it so much. Let me see if I can get this figured out again. There. Yes, it's made all the difference.
Very clean too. You said it was kind of messy, but like that looks very organized.
Well, I feel like because my works are somewhat small and the style or aesthetic is somewhat refined, you know, like if I were flinging paint or something, it would be a different scenario. Like if I was Lucian Freud or Francis Bacon, then it would probably look like a cave in here, but it works.
Awesome. Well, Ari, did you have any other questions for Sarah?
Yeah, I was gonna say, so back to school and teaching and things, what was it like for you teaching a studio class remotely? I know for me it's been kind of interesting, like having classes online and doing a little hybrid of, you know, going to the space in person for a little bit, but mostly everything else is done virtually. Like, what was that like? And when it came to critiques and things?
It's really challenging. I am not very good with technology, so it has been a constant struggle. I just, for whatever reason, I can't get it to work. So honestly, because of this, I knew I wouldn't be able to be at my best and give my students what they deserved if I was completely remote. We all had the option to do that, and I know some of my colleagues did, but I chose to do a blended format. So with my studio course, which was an advanced drawing course this semester, I met with them 2 days a week and then did individual online meetings just to make sure that they had a chance to interact with me without like worrying about a mask and trying to maintain 6 feet distance between us, just to kind of like, you know, have a chance for a little bit more intimacy in that way, even though it's through a computer screen. But yes, I had to do critiques online, and that was hard because we're not looking at it in person, but that was the only way to kind of get people to be able to comment, you know, in like a larger number on work that was being made. Wasn't ideal, but I will credit my students. They were so engaged this semester, and they did such a good job interacting with each other through online things that I had set up. Just to kind of keep dialogue going, because I think so much of a student, an art student especially, their experience is from just being in class with other artists, you know, like the kind of conversations that happen in passing or the things that are, you know, it's like you almost feel it. It's like in the atmosphere when you're being creative with a room full of people doing the same thing. I notice that when I go to a residency now, it's like you can feel it in the air and it keeps you inspired. So I feel like we're all having to make allowances for this, but I'm just really blown away at how engaged my students were. They were really professional about just dealing with it as it had to be dealt with. I also run the MFA program here at Missouri State University, and I teach graduate level classes. And this semester I taught a professional practice class, and it lent itself to being all virtual and online because I had a lot of guest lecturers come. But it's a time where I can address all the things that you don't necessarily know you're going to have to deal with when you take on a more, I guess, art as a career, you know, in whatever form that might be. So for example, you know, I had a lot of artists talking about their practice and how they find the balance and how they make ends meet in the various ways that they do. But also real world kind of like adulting skills. So I had, you know, an accountant come and speak to us about budgeting and budgeting for like studio goals. I had a financial advisor coming and talking to us about like setting up your retirement and things to know about investing. I also just recently this week had an attorney speak to us about contracts and the kinds of documents that artists need to be aware of to protect themselves. Because those kinds of things, they're not necessarily the fun part of art, but they're the things that I think empower you. Because if you don't understand, or if you don't know how to do it accurately, you can be harmed. So at least having it on your radar, I think, is one of the things I wanted my students to hopefully gain from this semester. So that was all online, but it worked out okay.
That's amazing. I think every artist, every MFA student should take a course like that. I think that's fantastic.
It's such an important topic, you know, and it's challenging because it's like numbers and professional documents and signatures and that kind of stuff. It can be scary because, I mean, just in my own experience, I never was required to take a personal finance class, you know. So I'm finding that a lot of other students don't have much experience with it either. So I want to try and give them space to learn.
That's
I
great.
love that. That's huge. It really is. And, you know, especially, you're so right. It's just really about protecting yourself. And I think that's so important. Obviously, we help our artists at the gallery with that, but
yes,
you're an artist just trying to show some, I mean, it's so hard. So I'm glad that, that's awesome.
Yeah.
That you're doing
You
that.
all are the pinnacle of professional. So I always love working with you. You're wonderful.
Thank you. Well, this has been so great. It has, even virtually, I loved getting a peek into your studio and talking to you. I'm sure Ari feels the same, and we're just so happy to see your face, even though it's on a computer. We can't wait to see you in person when we can again, and hopefully some new work. I can't wait to see how the Key West work develops and all the new foliage. Oh my gosh, it's so amazing. Very exciting.
And that's happening. It's interesting. I think that I wouldn't have dealt with the foliage like I did if I hadn't been already starting to deal with it in the Midwest too. I'm finding more and more I'm bringing yards into the compositions, and I'm really interested in like trees and shrubs and shadows on the ground and the way people keep their lawns. So I think it was just a transition, you know, from what I had been looking at into like a tropical land.
Well, I love that. And it's just another aspect of documenting another part of the country. And I think it's so important now more than ever. And there's such a comfort to your work. So I think on behalf of all of us, we appreciate it, especially in this time.
Well, thank you. And thank you all so much for giving me the space to show what I love and what I'm engaged with and what I have, you know, with my Midwestern pride. So I appreciate that.
Of course, we love it. And Sarah, thank you so much for joining us. And
Thank you.
we hope the last week of finals goes well. And then, you know, I hope your 2021 is going to start off with a bang, and we hope so for us too. And we just can't wait to talk again soon.
Absolutely. Best wishes to you all.
All right. Thanks, Sarah.
Thanks, Sarah.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.